Strings and for loops. In this video, we will learn how for loops can be used to help process strings. Consider the following program. In the first line, we declare a variable named x and set it equal to the string Texas 23. We then go on to print each character in that string one at a time, starting with the first character all the way down to the last character. This is an example of a program that processes each individual character in the string one at a time. In computer science, processing each character in the string one at a time is a very common task, and there are many reasons why a programmer would want to do so. For example, the programmer may want to count the number of letters in the string, or the programmer may want to count the number of digits in the string, or it may want to count the number of punctuation symbols in the string, or it may want to change each lowercase letter to an uppercase letter, and every uppercase letter to a lowercase letter, so on and so forth. The number of possible reasons why a programmer would want to process each individual character in a string is limitless. However, there is an issue with how we're doing it in this example. To illustrate why, imagine I were to come back to this code tomorrow and change the value in the string to a different value. Now my string has more characters. Thus, if my goal is still to process each individual characters, I'm now going to have to add more print statements. Likewise, suppose I were to come back to this code and change it to a string of smaller length. Now I have too many print statements, and thus will have to remove a few of them. Or worst of all, suppose my string contained 100 characters or 1,000 characters. Now I'm going to need 100 print statements or 1,000 print statements to be able to process each character, thus making our code tedious and repetitive, two things we never want in our program. Clearly, a more efficient approach for processing strings is needed, and this is where for loops will eventually come in. But before we get to that, consider the following 3 lines of code. In the first line, I once again declare a variable named x and set it equal to Texas 23. Then in the second line, I call the len method on x, store the result in a variable called length. Then in the next line, I print that value for length, which of course will be 7, because as we've discussed in earlier videos, the len method counts the number of characters in the string, and currently x has 7 characters. Now, suppose I use that length variable inside of a for loop. Recall from our discussions on for loops that whenever we give a single number to the range method, it creates a list of numbers containing 0 all the way up to, but not including that number. And then each of those numbers will get stored in the I variable one by one. Thus, in our for loop, if we're simply going to print out the value of I, then the numbers 0 through 6 is what will get printed out, because those are the numbers that the range method will generate. Now, notice that the numbers 0 through 6 also correspond exactly to the indexes that are being used for the string variable x, since x has 7 characters. So what does that tell you about the variable I? That if we so choose, we could also use I as the index to the string, since the numbers correspond exactly. So once again, if the number 0 through 6 is being stored inside the variable I, and we're treating I as an index in the string, then the output for this for loop is going to be each individual character in this string. Since the first iteration will print x bracket 0, the next iteration will print x bracket 1, then x bracket 2, and so on and so forth. Notice that this for loop accomplished the same task that the first example in this video accomplished, but only needed 1 print statement to do it, while the first example needed 7 print statements. Moreover, if I were to come back tomorrow and change x to a string value with different length, I still will not need to change my for loop. The for loop will still only need 1 print statement because it will naturally adapt to whatever the length of the string is. Even if my string were to contain 100 characters or 1,000 characters, once again, I still would not have to change the for loop because the for loop will naturally adapt to whatever the length of the string is. That all being said, processing strings 1 character at a time is so common in computer science that Python provides an even simpler way to do it. For example, consider this for loop header. Notice that here, instead of calling the range method, I simply gave the for loop header the name of a string variable. We already know that when the range method is used inside a for loop header, it creates a list of numbers. Well, when a string variable is used inside a for loop header, it generates a list of characters, a list of each of the characters that are stored inside that string variable in the exact order that they appear in the string. So, instead of individual numbers being stored inside the variable I, each character is going to get stored inside the variable I. Thus, in our starter for loop, all we have to do is print I. We don't need to treat I as an index because the I variable is already storing the individual character, thus producing this as our output.